Hello world, my name is Tim Roswick, and today we're going to talk about my top 3 podcasts in game design. These are game design specific podcasts. There's a lot of game dev podcasts, development, business, all that stuff, but I want to talk about game design specifically. Just in case you only came for the 3 podcasts, I'm just going to tell you what they are now. We got Designer Notes, we got the Clockwork Game Dev podcast, and the Spelunky Show. But if you care about why I like these and in-depth kind of analysis of some of their content, watch on. So the first one I want to talk about is Designer Notes. Now, when I first found this podcast, I kind of bounced off of it because I thought it was going to be about the journey of like game developers, and it's run by a guy named Soren Johnson, who was the lead designer on like Civ 3, Civ 4, and did Off-World Trading Company and a couple other games. And that's what he does. He talks to game designers, and he starts with how they first got into games, and he goes through their whole journey of like that whole process. But at first I thought that wasn't going to be interesting, but it absolutely is. And what ends up happening in these episodes is they share a lot of insight into how and why the games were made, because Soren is a designer himself, so the questions that he asks a lot are like very specific, like this game had this feature, why did you add that, and stuff like that. So I really like his insight. I really like some of the episodes. My favorites of Designer Notes are there's number 13 with Jamie Shang, which is the dude that runs Clay Entertainment. They did Don't Starve, Invisible Ink, Oxygen Not Included, a bunch of games like that, and this was a really good episode. There's also a 4-part series with Sid Meier, and each one of these episodes is like 2 hours long. There's like 6 or 8 hours of episodes of just talking about Sid Meier and stuff like this. So I highly recommend you do. I literally, when I say my top podcast, I don't mean like I kind of like these podcasts. I mean, I've listened to every single episode in this entire podcast and all of these podcasts, because I feel like they're the top of the top. Next up is the Clockwork Game Dev podcast run by Keith Burgun. Keith Burgun is a fantastic voice in game design. He runs a YouTube channel as well, and he has a book as well, and he shares his thoughts on game design, and he's got some strong opinions. I don't necessarily agree with all of his opinions, but that's one of the reasons why I like the podcast, because he is not afraid to share his opinions and tell you exactly what he thinks about how certain things go. He also designs strategy games, which we've talked about on the channel. I'm kind of into, so I find his insight on strategy games really, really interesting. He talks with a lot of designers. He dabbles in board game design and stuff too, so like there's a lot of like board game people, which I actually think is a good place to learn from if you're a video game designer, because board games, they have this like lack of complexity technically, that like you have to make sure your rules are solid and they're easy to understand and stuff like that, and I feel like there's a lot to learn from board games in general. So I recommend you give this podcast a listen. And the last one really caught me off guard. This one's called the Spelunky Show, and I read this on a series of like game dev podcast lists here and there, and I was just like, oh, but yeah, I'm not really, I mean, Spelunky's cool, but like I don't really want like a Spelunky podcast. I'm good. But then I listened to a few episodes, and it turns out this podcast is run by a series of game designers. And what they say is they use Spelunky as a lens through which to view game design. And at first that didn't really make sense to me. I was like, wait, it's a game design podcast after a game, but they compare other games to Spelunky. Is weird. But like I kept listening to it, and I really, really, really like this podcast, because it's run by a group of dudes, and they are all designers themselves. So a lot of the questions that they ask a lot of the people that they interview is based around like from a designer's perspective, like why did you do this, why did you do that, and it really helps you kind of understand the perspective of the designers and the different people they have on. They've also had some really cool people on, Mark Brown, Ryan Clark, which I talked about in my Bible genres video. There's a lot of like really, really cool people that have had really big successes with games, people that are thought leaders in the industry, and people that I really, really respect, and they've had them all on the podcast. I think this is probably the one that I found last, but I probably have referenced this podcast more than others. So like sometimes I'll actually save episodes and go back to them, because there's so many different tidbits in there And like a lot of the game design stuff that I talk about in this channel usually comes from some of this stuff too. So I recommend you check it out. That being said, that's all I got for you. I recommend you check out these podcasts. I'll have the links down for you below if you want to listen to them. But these people right here, they help me keep doing what I'm doing, and I want to say thank you. Thank you, patrons. You help me out. And I'm glad you're part of Game Dev Underground. If you want your name on this list, you can go to patreon.com/GameDevUnderground. Or you could just click on the podcast and start listening, because like you're in quarantine and it's boring as shit and like there's nothing else to do, so you might as well get some podcast stuff in your life. And if you enjoy my rants, you'll probably enjoy these people as well. But my name is Tim Elswick, and I'll see you again tomorrow for another daily game dev video.